At 10 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the world discovered the terrifying reality of the Mitsubishi A6M0. The scene was the Battle of Midway. The United States Navy was fighting for its survival, but in the air, the fight was already lost. The American pilots were veterans. Their planes, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, were rugged, armored, and reliable. But against the Zero, they were bricks. The Japanese Zero was a masterpiece of lethal engineering. It was lightweight, fast, and armed with twin 20mm cannons. But its greatest weapon was its maneuverability. The standard metric for aerial combat dominance is the turn radius. How tightly and quickly can a plane turn? The American Wildcat required 20 seconds to complete a full 360-degree turn at combat speed. The Japanese Zero required only 12 seconds. The mathematics of the dogfight were absolute: turn time, 0, 12 seconds, turn time, Wildcat, 20 seconds. If an American pilot attempted to engage the Zero in a standard turning fight, a dogfight, he was statistically dead. The Zero would simply circle inside the Wildcat's turn radius, plant itself on the American plane's tail, and finish the job with a burst of cannon fire. American pilots were being slaughtered. They were dying not from lack of courage, but from flawed doctrine and simple geometry. The strategy preached aggressive individual dogfighting, a philosophy carried over from World War I. But against the Zero, aggression was suicide. The U.S. Navy desperately needed a solution, but the engineers in California couldn't invent a faster plane overnight. The solution had to be found in the cockpit. The man who found it was Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch. Thatch was not an engineer. He was a thoughtful, soft-spoken squadron commander obsessed with two things: his pilot's safety and the pure geometry of aerial interception. Thatch knew the individual pilot had to lose the turning fight. The math was immutable. But he started asking a different question: could two pilots, working as a pair, defeat the Zero? Thatch retired to his small cabin aboard the USS Yorktown. He cleared his desk. He took a pencil and a piece of graph paper, or, as the legend goes, a cocktail napkin. He drew two dots, representing two American fighters, the section, or wingman pair. He drew a long, curved line representing the flight path of an attacking Zero, closing fast behind one of the pair. Thatch studied the lines. He calculated the closure speed. He realized that while the Zero could outturn the Wildcat, the attacking pilot was only focused on one thing: the target on his nose. The Zero pilot was statistically blinded by his own superior speed. Thatch began experimenting with lines on the paper. What if the target pilot didn't run? What if, when the Zero was committed and closing, both American pilots instantly turned inward, crossing paths directly in front of the enemy? He drew the maneuver. As the two American planes flew toward each other, the attacking Zero, committed to the first plane's tail, would find itself flying straight through the intersecting path. The Zero pilot, focused on his target, would momentarily lose sight of the target in the chaotic crossover. And when he regained sight, he would find himself directly in the line of fire of the second American plane, the wingman, who was now stationary and waiting. The Zero, relying on its speed, could not stop. The momentum would carry the Japanese fighter straight into the geometry of the trap. The Wildcat was slow. But in this specific, intersecting moment, the Zero's superior speed became its greatest weakness. Thatch looked at his drawing. The path looked like a figure eight or a complex weaving pattern, the Thatch weave. The principle was a geometric masterpiece of deception: don't outturn the enemy, force the enemy to fly into your prepared killing field. Thatch needed to test the idea immediately. This couldn't wait for official approval from Washington. He gathered his squadron, the men whose lives were on the line. He showed them the diagram, drawn crudely with pencil and straight lines. "We are not going to dogfight anymore," Thatch told his pilots. "We are going to play chess. When the Zero attacks your tail, you turn into me. You turn towards your wingman. You trust the geometry. The pilots were skeptical. Turning into an attacker went against every survival instinct. It defied 2 decades of air combat doctrine. But Thatch had the numbers. He had the drawing. He demonstrated the specific angles and timings that made the trap mathematically inevitable for the Zero. The final element of the strategy was the psychological commitment. The pilots had to trust the math more than their own eyes. They had to execute the turn exactly when the Zero was closing fast, risking a collision with their own wingman to set the trap. The initial test was authorized, but it was viewed by the other squadron commanders as a desperate, insane experiment. Could a simple pattern drawn on a napkin really defeat the most dominant aircraft in the Pacific? The American fleet was about to sail into the pivotal Battle of Midway. The stakes were absolute. Thatch had 48 hours to turn his pilots into geometric assassins. If the maneuver failed, his entire squadron would be annihilated, and the fate of the Pacific War could hang in the balance. Thatch had 48 hours to reprogram his pilots. He was asking them to overwrite every instinct refined by years of flying. Instinct told them, when an attacker is on your tail, run, dive, or turn wide. Thatch told them, turn into the attacker. The training began immediately over the empty Pacific. Thatch used a chalk to draw the intersecting patterns on the hangar deck. He demonstrated the specific points where the Zero's vector would carry it into the wingman's line of fire. The pilots were skeptical. They practiced the weave at altitude, flying their heavy Wildcat fighters dangerously close to each other, often risking mid-air collision. The difficulty was psychological. Trusting a line drawn on paper over the primal instinct to evade was the highest hurdle. Thatch reinforced the math of the deception. The Zero pilot, closing at 400 miles per hour, relies on the assumption that the target will obey traditional evasion rules. The moment the Wildcat turns inward, the Zero pilot must make a split-second decision, continue the closure path, or abort. Because the turn is aggressive and instantaneous, the Zero pilot's speed, his greatest weapon, becomes a liability. The kinetic energy makes it nearly impossible to abort without stalling. The pilots had to learn to fly not by sight, but by geometry. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The American fleet located the Japanese carriers. The Battle of Midway was imminent. Thatch's squadron, VF-3, launched from the USS Yorktown. The mission was pure defense. The moment of truth arrived shortly after the Japanese dive bombers began their attack runs. Thatch's flight of 4 Wildcats was engaged by 3 Zero fighters. The Zeros immediately used their superior speed to gain altitude and turn rate advantage. Thatch watched his wingman, Ensign RAM Dusty Rhodes, take evasive action. A Zero instantly locked onto Rhodes's tail. The Zero pilot was efficient and precise. He was closing for the clean kill. Thatch knew the math. Rhodes had 20 seconds of turn time. The Zero needed 12. Rhodes was already dead. Rhodes, execute weave. Now. Thatch's voice was cold and precise over the radio. Rhodes responded instantly. He snapped his Wildcat into a sharp, immediate turn toward his own flight leader, directly into Thatch's path. Thatch simultaneously turned his plane inward toward Rhodes. The 2 American planes crossed in front of the attacking Zero at high speed. The sight was terrifying. The distance between the Wildcat wingtips was measured in feet. The Zero pilot, committed to the chase, flew directly into the center of the geometric pattern. The result was immediate and fatal for the Japanese. The Zero pilot, blinded by the sudden crossing motion and focused entirely on his initial target, momentarily lost sight of Rhodes. When he saw the object reappear, it was Thatch's plane, and the Zero was positioned perfectly in Thatch's gun sight. Thatch opened fire. The 6.50 caliber machine guns of the Wildcat ripped into the Zero's unarmored fuselage. The Zero didn't burn. It disintegrated into a shower of aluminum shards and smoke. The pilot, who relied on speed to survive, was killed by geometry. The execution was clean. The statistical flaw was exploited. But the fight wasn't over. The remaining 2 Zeros, confused by the sudden death of their leader, repositioned. 1 Zero locked onto Thatch's tail. Thatch called the weave again. He turned inward toward his surviving wingman, Lieutenant E.S. Whitey Faitner. Faitner, who had just witnessed the success, executed the opposing turn. Again, the Zero was forced into the killing zone. Faitner opened fire. The Zero was struck in the engine cowling and plummeted into the ocean. The Zero pilots could not believe what they were seeing. They were trained to execute the perfect turning fight. They were trained to believe their plane was invincible in a maneuver. They had been defeated not by superior engineering, but by a simple, repeating pattern. The statistical reality was inverted. Thatch and his wingmen were engaging in a maneuver that looked suicidal, risking collision with their own aircraft, but was, in reality, a geometric certainty of survival. Thatch's 4-plane flight returned to the Yorktown that afternoon. The debriefing was immediate. The pilots, shaking with adrenaline, described the geometry. They confirmed the Zero pilots were unable to cope with the sudden, counterintuitive maneuver. The tactical analysis was cold. The Zero was mathematically superior in a 1v1 turn, but it was statistically paralyzed by a planned 2v1 crossover. Thatch's solution was passed down through the decks of the carriers like wildfire. It was not a formal doctrine yet. It was a secret, whispered truth between pilots. They grabbed napkins, pencils, and charts, drawing the figure-8 pattern. They practiced the weave in the air whenever they could. The Japanese pilots, still relying on their absolute superiority in the turning fight, were about to face a new, deadly tactical reality in the coming months, a geometric pattern that would turn their best weapon against them. Following the Battle of Midway, the Thatch weave spread through the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps fighter squadrons like a virus. It was a secret passed pilot to pilot, often learned not from official manuals, but from greasy diagrams drawn on locker doors and plywood squadron maps. The math of aerial combat was instantly inverted. The Wildcat, the slow, stubborn American fighter, was suddenly capable of surviving and winning engagements against the supposedly superior Zero. The engagement statistics from the Solomon Islands campaign provided the cold, procedural proof. American loss rates dropped significantly. The kill ratio of Zeros destroyed per Wildcat lost climbed steeply. Geometry was defeating superior engineering. The Japanese high command was baffled. Their after-action reports noted the unexpected tenacity, and the bizarre, aggressive teamwork of the American pilots. They could not understand why the Americans were suddenly risking collision by turning into one another. The tactic defied all known aerial doctrine. The Zero pilots were now caught in a fatal statistical trap. If they engaged in a standard turning fight, the Wildcat pairs would execute the weave, and the Zero would fly directly into the wingman's fire. Certain death. If they tried to avoid the weave by engaging from far outside the turn, their advantage was neutralized, and they wasted valuable ammunition. The Japanese Air Force was forced to change its fundamental doctrine. They tacitly admitted defeat in the turning fight. They abandoned the close-quarters maneuvering that defined the Zero. They adopted a new style, boom and zoom, high-speed hit-and-run attacks, using their speed and altitude advantage to dive, fire, and escape, refusing to enter the low-altitude geometric trap. The move was a massive psychological victory for Thatch. He had forced the enemy to give up their greatest asset. But the resistance to the stupid solution came not from the enemy, but from the Admiralty. Thatch immediately filed an official report advocating for the Thatch weave to be adopted as standard fighter doctrine. He provided the cold combat statistics, the diagrams, and the testimony of his surviving pilots. The High Command rejected the solution initially. The problem was simple: prestige. The U.S. Navy favored massive technological solutions, bigger ships, faster planes, more powerful radar. They were reluctant to admit that the greatest strategic victory in the air war was achieved by a simple, geometric pattern drawn on a napkin, and not by a multimillion-dollar R&D program. Furthermore, the maneuver was deemed too simple. It felt like cheating. It challenged decades of traditional air combat philosophy. It gave too much credit to the enlisted pilot and too little to the engineering corps. Thatch was forced to fight a bureaucratic war of attrition. He and his team spent months traveling to bases, teaching the technique manually, circumventing the official channels. The pilots, however, were quicker to grasp the reality. They didn't care about doctrine, they cared about survival. Whenever a new squadron arrived in the Pacific, the first question pilots asked was not, "Where is the new bomb site?" but, "Show us the weave." The tactic became standard practice in the field before it became official doctrine in Washington. The final official approval only came when the statistical evidence became undeniable. The success of the weave was directly responsible for the U.S. survival during the early, critical phases of the Guadalcanal campaign, where the number of available fighters was minimal, but the efficiency of the tactics was maximum. The Navy finally formalized the doctrine, but in a final act of bureaucratic sanitization, Thatch's name was often quietly removed from the official training manuals. The invention, born from desperation and genius, was absorbed into the vast, impersonal machinery of U.S. Navy fighter tactics. The genius of John S. Jimmy Thatch was officially filed away, diluted into the abstract concept of teamwork. The Air Command received the credit for the vision. The pilots received the credit for the bravery. Thatch, the geometric assassin, received the silence. His squadron, however, knew the truth. They knew that when a zero locked onto their tail, their lives depended not on the speed of their engine, but on the simple, counterintuitive geometry of a figure-8 pattern. The Wildcat, the slow piston plane, had beaten the zero. The physics of speed had been defeated by the precision of a drawing. The Thatch weave, the simple, counterintuitive geometry drawn on a cocktail napkin, remained the defining tactical innovation of the early Pacific War. The tactic, once considered a suicidal improvisation, became the standardized method for American pilots to survive against the zero. The statistics provided the final, irrefutable evidence. The U.S. Navy maintained air superiority, not just because of the arrival of the more powerful Grumman Hellcat, but because the new plane incorporated Thatch's geometric principles into its core doctrine. The advantage of the zero was neutralized entirely. Thatch continued his career, serving through the war and eventually rising to the rank of 4-star admiral. He was an embodiment of the successful innovation he created, but the doctrine remained a secret. The public narrative credited the victory to technology, superior engines, better armor, and more powerful cannons. The true solution, the simple figure-8 maneuver, was too cheap and too abstract for headlines. The military establishment, having initially resisted the simple drawing, continued its tradition of sanitization. The Thatch weave was formalized and taught to every generation of naval and marine fighter pilots, but the attribution was often muted or erased. It became known merely as section defense or basic defensive formation, a statistical necessity rather than the genius of a single man. The innovation was too valuable to abandon, but the inventor was too low-ranking to receive full, perpetual credit. Thatch, having survived the war, carried the secret of his invention with him throughout his career, maintaining the silence necessary to protect the tactic. The ultimate vindication of the weave came decades later, with the advent of the jet age. Fighters became faster. Missiles replaced machine guns. But the principles of geometry and visual deception remained paramount. At the United States Navy Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun, the basic defensive tactics taught to elite pilots still incorporate the core geometric principles Thatch first drew on that napkin in 1942. The fundamental law of kinetic energy, that speed makes it harder to stop, has not changed. The weave, adapted for jet speeds and missile engagements, is still used to defeat an aggressor committed to an attack path. Thatch retired in 1967. He lived to see his tactical drawing become the foundation of modern naval air combat training. He died in 1981. His passing was noted with the honors befitting a high-ranking admiral, but the true scope of his legacy, the countless lives saved because his specific drawing was trusted, remained obscured by the layers of bureaucracy. The historical paradox of the Thatch weave is clear: the invention was a statistical masterpiece of low-tech ingenuity, but it was too simple for the Navy to celebrate and too effective for them to ever abandon. The pilots flying today, relying on advanced radar and millions of dollars in equipment, are still, fundamentally, flying by the rules of geometry drawn by a lieutenant commander on a cocktail napkin. They are still trusting the simple math that their plane, however slow, can force a faster attacker to statistically die. And now you know the source of that simple, life-saving geometry. The war in the Pacific was won not by the superiority of the Wildcat's engine, but by the superiority of Thatch's geometric design. If this story moved you, hit that like button. We are dedicated to finding the stories of the tactical innovators and the unsung heroes who proved that the simplest solutions often hold the greatest power. Hit subscribe and join our community of history keepers. We ensure the truth of the tactical secrets that won the war is never forgotten. Drop a comment below. Tell us if you think the Thatch weave remains the most ingenious tactical fix of World War II. You are now the custodian of this specific, beautiful piece of geometry. Thank you for remembering.